Thanks for joining today. We are really excited to have you, Jonathan, Francesca, and myself. We are returned Peace Corps volunteers, and we are here today to share a little bit with you about Peace Corps in honor of Peace Corps Week, which was actually last week. Hopefully you read some of our articles in this month's newsletter. But we are really excited to share our experiences with you. We're celebrating 60 years of the Peace Corps this year. So I hope you all have at least a general understanding of what the Peace Corps is, but I know there's probably at least a few of you who don't have specifics. So I thought we could start with a video which just recaps the history of the agency and the mission, and then we'll move into our specific presentations.
But what does the man who started the Peace Corps think about it now?
The willingness of all Americans, men and women, young and old, to serve in the Peace Corps, to serve in all parts of the world, to serve at little pay, to do jobs that most of them have never done before, is one of the most encouraging manifestations of the American spirit this country has seen in many years. Peace Corps gives us a chance to show a side of our country which is too often submerged. Our desire to live in peace, our desire to be of help.
Today, hope endures. In fact, it's as strong as it was when we started our journey in 1961. Maybe even stronger. Every day, Peace Corps volunteers and all of us who support them wake up and spend the day working hard to make the world a better place. The larger causes we serve are the farmers in Panama, businesswomen in Albania, students in Rwanda, environmentalists in Jamaica, healthcare workers in South Africa. Our work is manifested in them and the thousands and thousands of others we'll never meet. It's a two-way street. Or, more accurately with Peace Corps, a two-way dirt road or footpath. And that volunteers venture to far-flung corners of the world and bring back to the United States after they serve more knowledge of, compassion for, and ability to ensure peace. They live it, promote it, and never stop sharing it. Peace is the first word of who we are. That our mission and goals haven't changed in nearly 60 years is rare, and so are we. The peace and freedom President Kennedy harnessed then continues now. That spirit still sparks our service. Who are we? We're the Peace Corps.
I hope this spirit will grow, that hundreds of others of young Americans and older Americans will go overseas to show our best side, to show how much we desire to live at peace. There can be no greater service to our country, and no source of pride more real than to be a member of the Peace Corps of the United States. I hope that you will join.
All right, next slide, Adrienne. So it's interesting, especially working at the Corps, to think about how easily it is for us to share our mission. I think something that happened for me in the Peace Corps was they pounded into our heads very early on what the mission of the Peace Corps was. Obviously, we used our own words to explain it, but I still carry what I learned about the mission and how easy it was to explain 25 years later. So the mission is articulated here in Peace Corps' words, but really it was about, sharing what we knew or a little bit about something we had just learned. It was about learning about another country and the people and the way they lived. And then it was, when it was all said and done, about coming back here to the United States and sharing our experience about living in another country and bringing back all the things that we learned. I think each one of us that you'll hear from today, we had ideas about why we were joining the Peace Corps, and they changed, and as, even as early as a few months in, you realize that it was so much more about what we were gaining than what we were sharing. So that is the mission or the purpose behind Peace Corps Week each year, is for us to share our experiences with people we know. So that's what we're doing today. Next slide. So right now we have 4 RPCVs. We call ourselves RPCVs, Returned Peace Corps Volunteers, here at the LA Conservation Corps. I am the oldest, and my service is the oldest. So I finished up in the Peace Corps 25 years ago in Ecuador. Jonathan is about 10 years after me, and he served in Madagascar from 2010, I guess 15 years, to 2013. I think Erica was soon after I was. So in order, I guess it's me and then Erica. Erica was in Micronesia from 1998 to 2000. Jonathan in Madagascar from 2010 to 2013. And Francesca is our newest addition, just leaving the Peace Corps a couple of years ago. She was in Panama for 2 years. So you'll be hearing from me and Jonathan and Francesca today. So I served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador from 94 to 96. Next slide. I lived and worked in 2 sites, which isn't the norm, but both were in Ecuador's coastal region. So this is hard to see, but if you look over on the left, you'll see a couple pins over there on the coastal side of the country. Next slide. So I joined the Peace Corps a few weeks before I turned 25, and I hadn't ever really spent much time outside of the United States. So one of my very vivid memories is those first few days when we landed in Quito, which is the capital of Ecuador, where we started training. And those were really, really rough days. Really had some thoughts about, did I make the right decision? My fellow PCVs and I spent the next 3 months at Peace Corps Ecuador's training center, which wasn't far from Quito, down the hill in Tumbaco, where we bonded as an omnibus. So that's what we called ourselves in Ecuador. That was just each new group of Peace Corps volunteers. It's a fancy word for group or cohort. And we learned Spanish from our Ecuadorian teachers. 2 of my teachers are there outside our training center. We learned more about the skills we'd be sharing as rural health volunteers. And we lived with an Ecuadorian family, and that's my family there. Next slide, please. Since my primary motivation for joining the Peace Corps was to grow up, and it was more personal than professional, I volunteered for the most rural and difficult to reach site. During the rainy season, which could span 3 to 4 months each year, it took 6 or so hours to get into or out of my site, which was named Membrillo, which is located in the coastal highlands. Canoes, horse and mule rides, and trips in open-air minibuses were all involved. The photo on the left was the place where the road ended, and the canoe and/or the bareback, yep, no saddles, rides began. I took the middle photo to send to my parents to show them the size of my first place of residence. It was a storage room at the old dilapidated health center in Membrillo. From there, I moved into an exam room of the newly built health center that was still without windows. So the townspeople created a lattice work of halved bamboo shoots to close my room off from the outside. I landed in a vacant house on the edge of town. The photo on the right was a rite of passage. Any other PCV who came to visit me had to pose in front of my outhouse before leaving. I learned a lot of humility in Membrillo. My counterpart was the town nurse, who was really more like the town doctor. In those days, I don't know if this is still the case, but all the doctors had to complete a year of rural medical service before they were fully licensed. And because Membrillo was so far from civilization, the doctors placed there always found excuses not to show up. So Mariana, my counterpart, performed procedures better suited to a physician. I was called Licenciada Wendy, which for me meant that I had a college degree. But for the residents in Membrillo and for Mariana, it meant I had studied to be a nurse. Suffice it to say that before my Spanish was good enough to tell her that the only medical experience I had before Peace Corps was as a volunteer at children's hospitals, she asked me to start IVs, stitch up wounds, and help deliver babies. I was a shy Spanish speaker. I wouldn't speak unless I was certain I was using proper grammar, so there was lots of silence for me that first year. In retrospect, that was not such a bad thing. I soaked up the experience and did a lot of listening. Living so independently definitely pushed me out of my comfort zone and built my confidence to work through challenging situations on my own. Next slide, please. The photo in the top left corner was taken near Membrillo. Some of my work was in the town's health center. The rest of it involved hiking into even more remote places to teach children and mothers mostly about ways to stay and live healthy. For the next few months, I also accompanied a team of folks from Plan International who would pick me up in their Land Rover to drive into the countryside to give vaccines. When they pulled out of my region, I struggled with my purpose, and I requested a move to somewhere else where I might be able to make a more profound impact. After a year in Membrillo, I found a new site and assignment and moved to the Central Coast, to the town of Canoa, where I shifted my focus and provided environmental education at the local middle school and rolled out a recycling education and collection campaign. Neither site had running water and hardly ever had any form of electricity, so I learned to wake with the sun and retire when it set. Next slide, please. I was dating my now husband when I left for Ecuador, and he headed off to Uruguay for his Peace Corps experience. Pictured on the left is a fraction of the letters he wrote off until the very end of my service. So our letters were filled with details of our work and the experiences and were our daily connection to one another. We visited each other once each. This picture was from when he came to visit me, and we did some traveling through Ecuador. My parents, and specifically my dad, also sent many letters. The photo on the right is just a small portion of his letters and my mother's cards. One of the gifts of my Peace Corps experience was a rich deepening of my relationship with my dad. His letters are cherished memories of our back and forth dialogue, his sincere interest in my experience, and his strong support of my service. The Footprints poem on the right was something he gave to me before I left, and that I held on to throughout my 2 years and beyond. Whenever I got lonely or homesick, I read it and was reminded of my strong support system. Next slide, please. So each of us is going to share some photos of food, because that was always a really important part of the Peace Corps experience. So here you'll see on the left is encebollado, which is fish soup, which you used to be able to buy on the street. Yapingachos, those are potato pancakes filled with campo cheese, which is a very salty cheese and really the only cheese in Ecuador at the time. And on the right is minestra, which is kind of a lentil soup that is served with rice. While the food options were limited, they helped to make my experience memorable. Next slide, please. There were so many adventures with my fellow PCVs. We traveled to tourist destinations like Baños, which is in the top left, and Cuenca, which is the top right, made our own holiday celebrations, took part in Ecuador's annual traditions, and soaked up all of the unique aspects of living in Ecuador. Next slide, please. But some of my most cherished memories are from my travels with my parents, who came to visit me twice. We traveled to cultural sites in Ecuador and Peru and took the train to Machu Picchu, and they visited me, and they visited my second site. There was something so rich and special about sharing these things with them. As the only one who spoke the language, I learned how to take care of them instead of them taking care of me. And it provided us with an opportunity to spend some truly quality time together. Next slide, please. All these years later, it's the people and the friendships that stick in my mind. So many of the details of my days in Ecuador have vanished. In my second site, I made friends with a woman who was my age. Nancy was married and had 2 kids. Her daughter's name was Wendy, too. Nancy made my experience in the Peace Corps. She was so patient and kind to me. We lived half a block or so from one another, and she operated a small tienda from the front of her home. I spent hours sitting with her there, practicing Spanish and watching her navigate her life as a mother, wife, and businesswoman. She brought me food sometimes. My favorite was the cocolon, which is the burned rice from the bottom of the oil-lined pan. We recently connected on Facebook, and I learned that she went back to school and is now an attorney, working on issues that affect women in Ecuador. She was a true angel. Of course, my friendships with my core group of PCVs is another gift of my Peace Corps experience. There were 6 of us, one is missing in this photo, who traveled together and hung out a lot. Lisa on my right in this photo is one of my dearest friends. We all gathered at her house in Denver a few years back, and all 6 of us have reconnected as a group during the pandemic and meet and catch up virtually over Zoom every month or so now. Next slide, please. Peace Corps taught me so much, but it also served as my career pathway accelerator. I committed myself to work for a nonprofit and continue to serve the environment after my life-changing experience in Ecuador. I learned from my neighbors in Membrillo how important proper care of the land is. They farmed cacao, bananas, and peanuts and lived off the land. The people in the small communities where I hiked to give my charlas always welcomed me and were open to new information. The bottom right photo is in the wetlands near Bahia, not far from Canoa. Another volunteer lived there, and he and I met up to teach a group of middle school students about the flora and fauna of this unique ecosystem. I returned to the States and earned my MBA in international finance with the thinking that I might return to work outside the States again one day. And I sought out a position at the LA Conservation Corps. I was hired to teach Corps members about recycling and our environmental work, and the rest is history. So before we move on, I wanted to introduce somebody who's on the Zoom. Jen Graff Sims is the volunteer who took over my site when I left, and she is actually now doing some recruiting for Peace Corps. So she's going to talk to us at the end of the presentation about what it takes nowadays to be a Peace Corps volunteer. But next we're going to hear from Jonathan. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Hi everyone, good morning or good afternoon, I guess. So yeah, my name is Jonathan Mason. I served in Madagascar 2010 to 2013. If you want to go to the next slide. So Madagascar, it's in this picture, it's in kind of like the bottom right down there, and you can see, I'm using my cursor, you can see the pin drop on the northwest coast, where I lived in Angiabori. I lived there for 2 years. And then I moved to, there's a little peninsula off the northeast coast. You can't really see it in this picture. So I extended for a year, which I'll get to a little bit. And I lived off that peninsula for about 6 months before I moved back to a similar region where I was for the final 6 months. So before Peace Corps, my story, I had graduated from undergrad with a degree in history. I was interested in development policy, poverty alleviation. So when I eventually did get around to applying to Peace Corps, they actually sent me to Madagascar, surprise to me. I think because a couple reasons. I had taken French as my high school language, college language. I was nowhere near fluent at all. I was still a beginner. And then as far as hard skills to apply, I wasn't sure, but they saw my landscaping background and took that. I had done some landscaping in high school. And took that and sent me to Madagascar to work on the agriculture and environment program. So next slide. So like Wendy, we stayed in training for 2 months, living with a family near the central part of the country. And then after 2 months, we were all sent out to site. So this was my site for the first 2 years. This is Angiabori. So Angiabori, a bit about the area. It is actually, it's in a river valley, the Sambirano River. And all along the valley is rice. Rice is the staple crop in Madagascar. It's the staple food. It is what you eat every meal. So that's what you see in the foreground are rice fields. And then in the background, these are natural forests, most of them converted to cocoa crop, like tree farms now. But in the background, you can still see that there's some clear cutting at the top of the saddles up there for rice propagation, because essentially the population of Madagascar is growing too quickly for it to sustain itself off of valley floor rice farming. So yeah, so this is actually a picture of some rice farming. In entering Madagascar, everyone who is working on the environment program is basically trained on rice intensification system. It's a system that was developed a few decades ago, I think actually in Madagascar, but now it's gone worldwide. It basically intensifies how much crop yield you can get by using different water management techniques and weeding techniques. Most Malagasy, a lot of them don't have access to this type of land. This is some pretty healthy, fertile land to grow rice in. Like I mentioned, a lot of it is going to be on mountainside. But those that do have access to this and can manage the water entering and exiting their fields, you can produce a lot more, basically crop yield with this. Rice farming, it is intense. It is days and hours under the sun every single week of the year. In Madagascar, depending on where you live, you can usually get 2 to 3 crops out of rice farming. Rice farming, it was, like I said, very intense, but it was not my main focus, which is I was grateful for, because I actually was exposed to something a lot more unique, which is the next slide. So this is cocoa farming. So cacao, cocoa, whatever you want to call it, it's where chocolate comes from. They grow in pods about the size of a football on trees, a small football, some can be large footballs. Most of the cocoa in the world comes from West Africa, originally from Central America, I believe. But then it was brought to French West Africa and then also introduced to Madagascar. So the Samburanu Valley, where I was living, that's actually the production place for cocoa in Madagascar. So when I arrived in Madagascar, I had no cocoa training. There's no cocoa in Mississippi, where I'm from. There's no cocoa in New York City, where I went to school. So they trained me on how to essentially improve the farming techniques. So that's improved pruning, fertilizer application, when and how to appropriately harvest. And then a bit later, I'll show you more about the processing of it too. In Anjibori, there was an established farmers cooperative that I was working with, and they had kind of a nascent relationship with a chocolate company that was started by 2 former Peace Corps volunteers in Madagascar. So they were trying to establish trial contracts for those farmers cooperatives, essentially to provide the farmers cooperatives more stability as the price of cocoa fluctuates. So that's essentially the idea, that if you can stabilize the price for the farmers, then they can take more risks, whether it's with spending money on education for their children or spending money on their crops. So the next slide, please. So this is basically the harvest, and then this is what you do after they fall off the tree. The long stick that guy had is called lagafu. A lot of these words are just kind of taken from French and then just colloquialized. So you get all these pods on the ground. You can see them. This is a colleague of mine, a friend of mine from the village. He's cutting up all the, breaking open all the cocoa, and then inside, and this is his cow who carries the cocoa home. And yeah, cows can climb mountains, which is amazing with cocoa on their backs. So next slide, please. And then this is what it looks like. This is basically what was the pile at his feet, all these pods. And then the actual cocoa that we eat, that's the white stuff is the flesh. That's kind of sweet, sour. You can suck on it. You can put it on your mouth. Put it in your mouth. You can take the white pulp off, but there's not a lot of meat there. It's basically covering a big seed. And this each cocoa pod weighs about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds, maybe 2.5 pounds, depending on how big it is. And when I was working there, each harvest, all the farmers in that village, they all had their own plot of land or family plot of land, and essentially that drove how much wealth you had. Everyone had access to rice to some extent, but how big your cocoa crop trees were, how big your crop yield was, that determined your wealth essentially. So on any given day, cocoa, for example, it actually produces throughout the year, but there are 2 big high seasons. So sometimes your yield could be like 80 kilos in a day, or during the hungry months, it might just be like 10 kilos. So it really fluctuates throughout the year, which really helps with having a contract. So next slide, please. So after you get all those beans out, basically those cocoa beans, you put them in. The ideal way to ferment them, and this is the fermentation process of making chocolate, is to put them in these bins. You start at the top, 2 days in there. You mix it up. It gets to about I forget the temperature, but about 180 degrees on the inside during the fermentation process. Then you drop it down, mix it up some more to the second stage. Then you drop it down, mix it up some more to the third stage for about 6 to 7 days in those bins. And that's the ideal way to do it. The next best way is to put it into a burlap bag, but the most common way is to put it into plastic goonie bags, big plastic grocery bags, basically. But that doesn't really produce the best fermented cocoa, and it's not going to give you high quality cocoa. So since we were working with, a fair trade and organic chocolate company, they obviously wanted a higher level of fermentation, higher level of processing. So I was trained on how to adequately do like quality control check for this, and then train the farmers on how to do this. The next slide, please. So after about 6, 7 days in there, they all got to come out onto the ground so they can dry, because they're still wet, but they've gotten dark. They look more like a chocolate color. The best way to dry this so they're not scorched by the concrete, which is what they're growing, which is what they're drying on here, is some like elevated wood platforms. They didn't have those at this time. So this is just more traditional methods, putting it out onto the concrete slab, and it takes, depending on how hot it is, how much sun there is, maybe about 3-4 days to dry, dry a dump onto it. Next slide, please. So that was cocoa production. Another part of what I worked on with these cooperatives was their kind of organizational structures, community development projects, as part of being a fair trade certified producer. So this is just a picture trying to visualize that, where they're showing me like their high seasons, low seasons, essentially when rice, vari, is in short supply, and different ways that they could work with their buyer, the fair trade chocolate company, on what they could provide to help stabilize their economics for them in the hungry months. So that was mostly what I focused on, was cocoa, which was very nice. It was a nice break from rice, and I got to walk away with something like pretty special. Now, I mean, I love chocolate beforehand, but now it means something a lot more to me. Just home chocolate, you can, those chocolate beans on the ground, you can get those from probably Whole Foods, and I think it's most delicious to just like take it home, put it in a mortar and pestle, and then put whatever you want in there. If you pound it enough, you'll eventually get some oil to come out of it. You'll get the flavor, and then you can add peppers, vanilla, coffee, ginger, whatever you want to put in there. It's a real treat. Next slide, please. And then this is just some food to highlight. The bottom right, like I said, that's rice. This is actually out of proportion to what a normal Malagasy would be. It would normally be like a big bowl of rice, known as vari, V-A-R-Y. And then in my dialect, everything you eat with rice, that's known as kabaka. In my region, Malagasy, the base of the language is from Southeast Asia, actually, like Indonesia, Malaysian. And then later, those were the first inhabitants of Madagascar. They kind of went along the Indian coast, Northwest Africa, and down until they reached Madagascar. And then later you had African immigrants arrive, and they were more along the coast. So where I was, it was mostly highly influenced by the African immigration. So the words are a bit different. So vari is the rice, and then everything you eat with the rice is called kabaka. So that's going to be that would be a very nice meal at home. But in the bottom right, the top right is going to be, if you're out walking the streets, what you'll find. If you want some food to drink with your beer, this is what you'll find. Basically, beef and fat brochettes, some flatbreads, fried bananas, fried chicken, fried cassava, and then some different salads to go with it. And then on the top left is, one of my favorite fruits, jackfruit. I'm sure you've seen it in the store. It's delicious. It smells like bubble gum. I don't know what else. I don't know what it tastes like, but if you get some, be sure to check it out. Don't confuse it for durian from Southeast Asia. That is a lot different flavor. Next slide. And then I just wanted to include some music. Obviously, everyone's listening to radios, at least when I was there. But Fandrama, he was one of the biggest hits in Madagascar. I was there. He's still probably one of the biggest stars there. And I included a link on this, so that'll be shared out when the PDF of the slides are shared out. But just click on it. It's interesting music. It draws in a lot of sounds from all over the place. But because of the getting around the island is so hard, even the big stars, they go out to like small rural places and do concerts. This was actually at a bar somewhere in Madagascar in the Northwest. But yeah, we got to meet Fandrama, who's like one of the biggest musical stars in the country. So that was cool. And I think that's the last slide for me. Yes. So yeah, thank you all.
Okay, so I'm guessing it's my turn. Hi, I'm Francesca. I'm going to talk about my service. I served in Panama between 2017 and 2019. Next slide, please. Panama is an isthmus, so it's like this tiny little narrow space with two oceans on each side. I served on, I guess it was the south side of it, so closer to the Pacific Ocean. Next slide. All right, so the adventure. I had recently graduated from UC Riverside when I applied for Peace Corps. I hadn't really known too much about it. I just knew that I was a global studies major who had studied environmental policies in Latin America. So I just kind of wanted to get some real life experience with international development. And after talking to a recruiter at UCR, it seemed like a pretty good plan of action. And so when I was applying, and I know the application process has changed, but I think this might be how it is still, you choose your top 3 locations and different programs. So my top choice actually was Panama, and it was the Community Environmental Conservation Agent, which is the title of what I did. And fortunately, after a month, I was selected for an interview, and then 3 months, I got the formal acceptance into Peace Corps. So that was really exciting because at that point, all I had was internships with the community garden and the Office of Sustainability at UC Riverside, and I was working in the San Bernardino National Forest as an AmeriCorps volunteer for the 3 months between getting accepted and going to Peace Corps Panama. So once we got there, we had originally flown into Miami for a night, and then we flew to Panama City at Ciudad de Saber. And that was a really cool experience because it was an old military base for the canal. So it had a lot of just history to it, good and bad, obviously. So that picture in the bottom left corner is my entire cohort. I entered with half environmental volunteers and then half English teaching volunteers. So it was a really interesting dynamic between people who are going to go to rural sites and help with agriculture and people who are going to go to more developed sites and help teachers build an English program in their school. But we were able to help each other a lot. And honestly, the group dynamic between Group 80 was something that I cherish a lot, still moving forward. I met a lot of excellent people. The picture of the map, that shows a little part where I served, and then there was originally 7 of us who were sent to the province of Panama Oeste, which is West Panama, which means it was on the west side of the Panama Canal. Yeah, so those were the smaller, more rural communities. I was one of 3 people in my program that served in a site that didn't have electricity. I didn't have water during the summer months, and I only had 2 forms of transportation into my site. So it was definitely a a very hard to reach and then hard to live in environment that I was fully willing to accept. When my country director offered it to me, I was like, yes, that sounds great. So there was originally 7 of us. By the end, there was 5 of us in that province. We were the tiniest province. So regardless, I got really close to my other Peace Corps volunteers that lived close by. In the picture to the right of the map, that was my first host family. I lived with them for my first 3 months in Panama in the training community, Santa Rita. They're amazing. They're incredibly patient with me. I went with some Spanish, but I definitely suffered with confidence when speaking with them. So it was really great to learn from them and live with them. And then the picture on the far right top corner, that's Rosie. She was my neighbor in my actual community, Los Choros. And she was my best friend throughout. She was the one that came to the city, met me, took me back to the community, showed me where I would be living for 2 years. And then from there on, we were kind of inseparable, and she was my go-to person with any projects that I had in sight. And then the left corner, that is my host family. So I lived with an older couple. It was Justino and Rosie, and their son, Ariel. It was just the 4 of us in that house. And this picture was taken when my family came and visited me, my first Christmas there. And it was actually a really amazing experience seeing them all meet each other. But needless to say, that I had a great experience. I spent the whole 2 years in Los Choros, this tiny community of like 200 people, and just lived there, worked there, made friends, tried to learn as much of the culture as I could. Next slide. All right, so some of the challenges, I already touched on them. So the transportation was kind of unpredictable, and it was just like this whole thing that I had to learn. So I had 2 forms of transportation in and out of my community. They were called chivas, which translates to goat, but it's just a pickup truck that people would put little covers on and like wooden 2x4s in there to make it a bench. And you would just stuff as many people, things, and animals in there as possible, and then go on for 2 hours up the hill. And it varied, but it was definitely one of my favorite parts. And just learning how to navigate new transportation in different countries was always interesting, exhausting, but it was always a fun ride. And then once we were in the community, or in the provincial capital, La Chorrera, there was the Diablo Rojo, which was personally my favorite. It's just this really decorated school bus with, anytime I see a picture of it, I can just hear reggaeton music blasting, because there would always be music videos and really loud music, and it would only cost 25 cents and you can go straight to the city on that thing. So the no electricity, I had a solar panel that the previous volunteer had given to me because he knew that I didn't have anything because I wasn't anticipating it. And then a couple of cheap little solar panel lights that I had bought in a tienda. And that's what got me through my 2 years. And my project was a solar panel project for the community. So that kind of gave me a little more insight to the need for solar panels and electricity and their access to electricity. So it was really nice to like live through it and then try and help them through it while I was going through the same problems. And then another challenge that I had was no phone signal. There was maybe 2 hills in my community that I could hike up. And when I say hike, I mean like it was a hike. And I'd sit up there, sorry. And it would take maybe 20 minutes for my messages to come in. And in that time, my phone would probably die. So I got very used to very inconsistent communication with loved ones and the Peace Corps office. So every once in a while, at least once a week, I would try and make it out of my site into the capital province of La Chorrera to check my emails and my messages. But other than that, I got used to this very like detached form of life and living presently in my community. And I think it made it all the more rewarding to be there just in mind, spirit, and not be checking my phone constantly. So I did value that ability to check out from my phone. And then navigating the spread out community. A lot of my first 3 months in site was just asking people to walk me to their houses so I could just learn where they lived. A little insight into my community. It was no more than 200 people population-wise, a total of maybe 10 families as far as I could figure out. And it was built along a river that went into the Panama Canal. So there was often flooding, which also affected transportation, but the river was very fun in the summer and very scary in the winter, or the rainy season. And it was mostly hills and coffee farmers. So I spent a lot of time working with the Canal Authority and coffee farms and making sure that their program in the community was working out properly. So there was an incentive that all the local farmers have coffee trees to kind of like promote more shade around the river and protect it. But they also didn't want a lot of use of pesticides or chemicals that would pollute the water source. So we just had to make sure that they were maintaining their agreement to be sustainable farmers and doing everything that they could. There was one school, and I lived right next to it. And I think there was maybe 50 students in total. And there was one road in, one road out. So I would walk along this road, and then eventually I knew like, oh, I have to take a right at this street and crawl up this hill to get to this place where this family lives. So it was just kind of like figuring out where these houses were hidden in the hills. So that was always very interesting. And once I felt like I mastered the route, I was really proud. So the picture in the bottom right, that was my host dad, Justino. He was taking me to his coffee farm, which was really hidden. It was a whole day's walk. We would have taken horse, but he didn't trust me at that point. Eventually I got to use the horse to get to the coffee farm. Next slide, please. The culture. So I was in this community for the full 2 years. And so I had a lot of time to just try and integrate myself into it as much as possible. And an amazing thing about Panama and Peace Corps in general is that they give the volunteers 3 months just to no projects, just get to know the community. And in that time we do a community analysis to kind of like learn the needs of the community, the wants of the community, just generally how the community works. So we have like a lot of questions about population and religion, just so we can understand them better before imposing our own thoughts and beliefs on them to make it better. So that's what I thought was really sustainable about this sort of international development work that the Peace Corps promoted. So I got really involved. I was one of the organizers for the football league, or the soccer league, which we hosted every Sunday. And so they knew that there was a lot of beer drinking, and they knew that we would have a lot of recycling. So I was in charge of the recycling for that program. And I even got my closest volunteer, Nick, who was a 45-minute walk from my site, in the team. So you can see him in the upper left corner. And then I also joined a bingo club. We played bingo once a month. And it was really fun. It was actually a really important part of the culture. Any birthday parties had bingo. There was the bingo clubs. Any fundraisers through the school and church was usually through bingo. Yeah, so that picture, not in the right corner, but the one next to it, that is a bingo club that I was a part of. And then the picture in between the bingo and the soccer, that is a sombrero pintado. So that is just the hat that they wear typically. It's a typical fashion, so it's like a rural look. And it's just a woven hat. I actually own one. That's the process of mine being built. So the one in the middle with the stripes, that's pintado, which means it just has paint on it. It's black lines. And it's a status symbol. The more designs on it, the more money somebody spent on it. It's handcrafted item, so it looks good. I worked with 4 sombrero makers in my community to try and get them into artisanal fairs and to some like level of commerce so that they can start making money off of it. And they're really thankful for it. And then the top right corner is me in a pollera. A pollera is typical fashion as well. It's just a long, colorful dress with the top, with ruffles on the top. And typically you would wear it with tembleques, which were beaded hair pieces that you would put in, and they were heavy. Yeah, so it was really great. And like I said, I try to get involved as much as possible. I joined a typical club with a lot of the other 20-something-year-olds in my community. And we would go to other communities during church events or school events and perform dances. So that is me performing a dance with the other Peace Corps volunteer, Nick, who I forced to join with me. Yeah, it was actually our last dance. It was for the despedida, so the goodbye party for both of us. And we did a really funny dance, El Gallo y la Gallina, and which is actually kind of a highly inappropriate dance about the courtship of a chicken and a rooster, but they loved it, and it's still one of my fondest memories. I almost attached a video, but it's hard to watch because we forgot the steps halfway through. And the bottom left corner is just la cosecha. So it's all of the things that the farmers collect and dry in the sun, mostly coffee beans. So they would grow the coffee throughout the year and they would harvest it twice because it always blooms twice. And so once they got all the coffee off the trees and farms, they would drag it down to their houses, and then in between rains when it got sunny, they'd lay it down in the front yard, let it dry out. And so after 2 weeks of doing this, they would hand grind it themselves. And then people from the Canal Authority would come and help them sell their beans to Café Duran or any big coffee supplier that ran out of Panama. Yeah, so that's a little bit of the culture. Coffee, soccer, typical, bingo, all the fun stuff. Next slide. And here are my pictures of food. So I guess the most famous dish is arroz con pollo. That is the birthday dish. So whenever there's a birthday, you'd always have arroz con pollo with like some sort of potato salad and then cake. So that's the picture on the bottom left corner. It's just the red rice and chicken, cake, and they would put beets in their potato salad, which would give it this really vibrant pink color. And I think that's why they liked it for the birthday dish. It just make it colorful and pop. The top left corner is hojaldras and salchichas. So it's just hot dogs cooked with onion and tomato sauce. And then the hojaldra is just fried dough, but that's a staple breakfast. Most of the time, salchichas is like the hot dogs or any meat or poultry was a privilege to have. I would say I mostly ate just large bowls of rice with a little bit of beans. That's what I was typically served. The other one, the picture next to the fried dough and hot dogs, is a fried fish, patacones, and a little salad. So patacones are basically tostones, which is a plantain that's cut, double fried and smashed, which you can see them doing on top of the paila, which is a big cooking bowl that they would do on top of a fogon, which is a fire that would be made out of bricks and wood in the backyard or in the front yard. And then on the right is just like the tamale that they made in banana leaves and all the other fried food. But it was just a lot of fried food, mostly rice. I enjoyed all of it. I still think about the arroz con pollo every time a birthday comes up. And next slide, please. This is my house. This is where I lived for most of the 2 years, aside from the first 3 months that I was living with the host family. So in my program with Peace Corps Panama, we are meant to get to the site and we live with a host family for 3 years, or for 3 months. and learn a little bit about the culture, have people to go to if we have any questions. And then after the 3 months, we're allowed to start looking for our own housing. I was the second volunteer in my community, which meant that they had already built a house for the first volunteer. So I lived in the backyard of the first volunteer's host family, right next to the school. It was just a tiny one room wooden house, and then on the outside was the shower and the outhouse to the side. I was fortunate because it wasn't like 20 feet away from my house like most people had, so it was just right there around the corner. It was actually a really adorable house, and I recently learned that they tore it down due to the evacuations and the fact that they're not sure when the next Peace Corps volunteer is going to come. So they tore it down and like started using it for farming and as a pig pen, I'm pretty sure. But as you can see in the bottom picture, that was my view from my house. So that's what I would see most mornings as I drank my coffee before going to the school or going to the coffee farms. I would always catch the sunrise since I was on that no electricity timeline of waking up and going to sleep with the sun. And then this picture on the right, I had a number of environmental signs and like a basketball net in the front of my house, and the kids would always come by and stop and play, and it always brought me a lot of joy. Next slide, please. And then this is my projects. I did whatever I could for the community. I was sent there, and after my first 3 months, we have a meeting where the community votes on what projects they want me to do. And so they voted for solar panels, since most of them hadn't had a solar panel and were using the homemade gas lamps still. So with the solar panels, I used the environmental club to apply for the grant. And after 6 months, we were able to get the money, and we did a number of projects to help fund the other half of it. And by the end, 29 households in 3 communities were able to receive solar panels. And in that picture, you can see one of the participants with his solar panel. He smiles all the time, but he's not smiling in that picture. And the bottom picture on the left, that is my environmental club, and a number of Peace Corps volunteers that came and helped me with an environmental fair. That day we played bingo. We did a number of environmental workshops where we taught them how to compost and how to make organic pesticides and herbicides, and just another way of teaching waste and recycling, or waste management and recycling. The school let us host the event in the school, so that's where it is. It was always fun having huge events in which I can invite other Peace Corps volunteers to help me facilitate. And that was like one of the larger events that I had. In the top right corner, that's me with Rosie again. She was the president of my Women's Recycled Artisanal Artwork Club. So her and I would think of ideas of making recycled artisanal goods like tembleques or wallets made out of chip bags, and they would get really good at making them. Like I would teach them and they would teach me how to make them better. And then they would go and sell them at fairs or church events, and it was a way of giving these women a little more economic freedom and a way to provide for their family. And they really took with it. I'm pretty sure the club is still in place today. And then the picture next to that is the World Map Project. In my last couple months after closing the grant for my solar panel project, and once the environmental club was up and going, I decided to use some of the extra funds we had from some fundraisers that I did with the school and paint a world map. And they really like it, and they still send me pictures of it. They're like, we're taking care of it, because when I did it, I was like, the paint's gonna fade, so I hope you guys keep repainting it. And it's good to see that they're taking care of the upkeep. And then the top left corner, my second project, and probably the one I worked towards more often, was environmental education in the school. And I had 5 teachers in the school, and they're all multi-gradal. So it means like 2 or 3 grades would be in one classroom. So they always appreciated the help when like a teacher was teaching the 7th graders, I would teach the 2nd graders a lesson in science. We would do a lot of environmental days. So I would look at the environmental calendar. So if it was World River Day or World Recycling Day, I would go to the school and give a quick talk and lesson about it. And then we would do community cleanups with the school and also environmental movie days. I was fortunate to have some family friends send me a projector for my 2nd year in Peace Corps. And with that projector, we were able to use a huge solar panel from the school to power it and show movies like Lorax and Disney's Earth, Disney Ocean, and WALL-E, anything with environmental lessons in it, and just use that as an excuse of a fundraiser and a little treat for the students. Other than that, there is like a number of projects that I did within my free time or helped other volunteers with. And I don't know, it's definitely the projects and just seeking opportunity and rolling with what they give you is a great part about international development. Next slide.
Thank you,
And that is
Francesca. Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Jonathan. We are up against our hour, but so I want to make sure that if you need to drop off, you feel comfortable doing so. But as I mentioned earlier, the young woman who took over for my site when I left, Jen Graff Sims, is on with us today to talk a little bit about becoming an RPCV or becoming a PCV now. So this slide was dropped in with some links for you to click when we send out the PDF and about a 12-minute video about becoming a volunteer. But Jen has some slides to share with us as well. So welcome, Jen, and I will turn it over to you. We will take some questions at the end. I have until 2:30, but please feel free to drop off if you need to. We really appreciate you coming and hearing a little bit more about our experiences and about the Peace Corps. As you can tell, we like to talk about it. So thanks again, and I'll turn it over to you. Hi, Jen.
Hi, good to see you, Wendy.
I know, good to see you too. So next slide, please, Adrienne.
Okay, so everybody, well, one of the things we should be thinking about at this point is whether or not we think Peace Corps is for us. And people are always asking, you know, what can they do to have a competitive application? These days, competitive applications have a college degree and or 5 years of professional experience. I would think if you guys have been in your role for 5 years, depending on what you're doing with the Conservation Corps, that may count, but usually it's very specialized. It's something like sheep herding, right? So if you have 5 years of sheep herding or something like that, there's very specific positions like that. There is a specific kind of resume we like to see, and you can find more information on that, but on that you're showing if you have volunteer experience, that's seen as valued very high. If you have language experience, that's great. If you do research about Peace Corps, you know, at some point you will get interviewed or talk to somebody. It's always good to kind of know what you're getting into a bit. People who are competitive applicants are also very flexible, which I'm sure you guys are as Conservation Corps workers, and that you apply early. Typically they say it takes 6 to 9 months from when you first put in your application to when you end up in country. It might be more like a year now with the pandemic, but I'll get into that in just a bit. Next slide, please. So these are where the concentrations, the program area concentrations are. I'm guessing a lot of you guys might want to continue doing environmental work. This is a great way to do that. I myself was a health volunteer, but no matter what concentration you go in, you have the flexibility to kind of find your own projects, which are often called secondary projects. And it's just kind of what you and your community might come up with, or something that you see a need for. Next slide. You do have options about where to serve. So I think when one of you was talking, I'm not sure who mentioned it, but there are, typically there's two different ways to apply. One is now, as of right before the pandemic, you can either apply to serve where you're most needed, which you just apply and you say, hey, I'll go anywhere, do anything, and they try to match you up. At this time, if you're going to apply like today or in the next month or two, I would say apply that way. But there's also a way to apply where you can say, I only want to go to Madagascar and I only want to work in the environment if there's a position there. So you can get that specific. But because of the uncertainty, the future opportunities are only listed real generally. And now coming in June, so volunteers were evacuated about a year ago, and now we're just starting to kind of place them back in. You can imagine we have to work with all the different countries we're in, as far as immigration, as far as health, as far as, you know, keeping volunteers healthy, as far as keeping the communities healthy. So it's quite a process we're going through, but we are going to be starting to do that this summer. Next slide. This has a little bit about the application process, and that's just kind of so you have a general area. Important to know that there is a health history area. Some people can get hung up on that. There is a list on the General Peace Corps site of some illnesses that people with these illnesses, they find hard to place. So if you suffer from something, you kind of want to take a look at that. And you also go through a legal clearance at one point. So that's important to know. And like I said, typically this can take 6 to 9 months, maybe up to a year. I think that's my last slide, but let's see if I put something else in there. Oh, and so there is the link where you can find tons of information about Peace Corps, and that is it. So if anybody has questions for me or other speakers, I think we're ready for them.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank
We'll
you.
send out Jen's email too with the presentation, so you could chat to her directly. She's doing mostly, Jen, you're working at the University of Texas, right?
Yeah, but I'd be happy to answer questions. I'll probably have to turn you over to a recruiter in the area. They do it regionally. I do know a recruiter at USC, but I think that's the closest one, but there might be somebody who's closer depending on.
We're pretty close to USC, so that's a good one. So does anyone have any questions? Wow, I guess not. Well, we really appreciate it again. Thank you for joining, and reach out to us. The next slide has our email addresses. You all know how to reach us for the most part. But we really enjoyed sharing this with you, and hope to share more of our experiences with you one-on-one later on. So have a great weekend, and thanks again.
Yeah, thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Happy Peace Corps Week.
Thanks, Jen.